Hey, what is up? Welcome to Thursday's edition of Where All the Ladies At. This is the episode where we talk about deep dive into history and look at actual historical figures and talk about how badass they are. I am Kim. I'm your host. As always, I am a history nerd, a novelist, all kinds of crazy stuff. But I really have a passion for history, and I really have a passion for talking about ladies in it because I'm a little bit of a feminist, you know. I have 2 episodes a week on this podcast. The first one is is on Mondays. It is all about myth and legend and women in that. And then Thursday edition, as I said, is about real life historical badass ladies. And that's how it goes. I'm a little bit of a feminist. These episodes on Thursdays do sometimes tend to get a little political, so if that's something you're not into, I completely understand. I just want to give you a warning ahead of the time, especially in this day and age and how everything is going. I basically do have moments where I talk about feminism and what is currently going on in many countries, not only the U.S. So, with that being said, let's do some housekeeping and some shameless plugging. If you want to reach out to me, there's ways to do that in the description box. There's also ways to support the podcast financially. If you cannot do that, I completely understand. If you would just like, comment, share, review, subscribe, do all those kind of good things, get my name out there in the algorithm so more people get shown my stuff, and we can build a community where we get to talk about all these badass ladies together. I would love to do that. Oh my God, I would love that. Love to have a whole bunch of, people where we could talk about these badass ladies. If you would like more information about these ladies, and so much more, but definitely check out my Medium publication. And there is also a link to my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip. It is basically about tarot crystals, holistic healing, all kinds of that kind of stuff. So if you're into that, check it out too. I'd love to see you over there as well. Anyways, so this month, we have been celebrating Women's History Month. And as I've said so many times, even though pretty much every month is Women's History Month here on Where All the Ladies At, this month I really wanted to highlight women philosophers and also women who stood up against fascism. So if you haven't seen or heard those episodes, make sure you go back and check them out. I have covered Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt, and Dorothy Thompson. And today's episode is about another badass lady or young lady who stood up against fascism. And unfortunately, there's a tragic ending. So just be warned, okay? Also, I'd like to do like a little warning. There will be some discussion of violence and things like that because there was some violence committed, and I'm not going to edit it down. So I wanted to give you guys some heads up. All right. With that being said, let's get into the topic of the day. And the topic of the day is a very amazing, fearless young German student who stood up to the Nazis during World War II, and that is Sophie Scholl. Alright guys, so as usual, I like to do this. I like to go through what was happening in the world during the person's formative years, and also how it was like for women. If you listened to the last 3, you're probably going to hear a lot of the same things, but I really feel like it's important to get an idea of the environment that these individuals were living in and raised in, so you can see the whole package when it comes to their story, okay? So, we're going to start off, though we're going to wind up in Nazi Germany, we got to take a few steps back, right? So, to give you an idea of the Weimar Republic or Germany and all that. So, the Weimar Republic was established in 1919. It was basically Germany trying to pick up the pieces after they were defeated in World War One. And of course, this wasn't your typical new government. This was really a time in Germany and in the Prussian area of instability, right? And it all started with the Treaty of Versailles, right? The Treaty of Versailles basically was Germany's it was like, hey, you started it, you have to finish it for, right? And this put that part of the world in a very tough spot, right? They were responsible for the war and they were responsible for paying the reparations, and the economy coming out of the war was pretty much in shambles. The people were really struggling just to kind of make ends meet. In fact, inflation was so out of control that in 1923, I have to read this, the value of the mark dropped so dramatic that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy basic things like bread. People lost their jobs, they lost their savings, and in some aspects, they lost their dignity and hope in a lot of the time. Then in the middle of this chaos, right? Everything's going wrong. Great Depression hits. 1929, global economy crashes. Germany had been starting to make a little bit of way back, but only because they were taking things from the economy, and Germany felt it harder because of the situations they were in some aspects, right? Factories closed down, unemployment skyrocketed, people were looking for something or someone to blame. And this is when the party and the political landscapes of Germany really started to kind of unravel. People wanted answers, right? They wanted change. They wanted someone to fix it all for them. And that someone just happened to be the man with the funny mustache. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party stepped up and said everything the people wanted to hear, right? Hitler promised to restore Germany to greatness, to fix the economy, to bring back the glory days of the past. And with the economy in ruins, the people were so frustrated, it was very easy for the Nazi party to come into power, right? They took advantage of this widespread discontent and really cemented their place in there, right? So by the time Sophie Scholl was born in 1921, Germany was already in the grip of Weimar Republic's chaos, right? And as she began to grow up, the country slid even more into this nightmare of Nazi rule. It was at a time when freedom was shrinking, rights were being stripped away, and the very essence of what Germany had once been was being rewritten. Except that this time it was going in a very, very dangerous direction. The Weimar Republic was pretty much cradle of German democracy, right? But it was also the stage of a very tragic collapse. And that tragic collapse gave birth to the totalitarian nightmare that would follow, right? That's what opened the door for the Nazis. I would like everybody in America that is listening and watching to pay attention to that. Maybe go back and listen to that again, because it is what is happening in the US. And it's not too late to maybe stop it. Maybe. We'll see how it goes. Anyways, that was my little political thing. So, what was it like for women in the Weimar Republic? Well, the Weimar years were actually a time of some major progress for women. It was the first time women were granted the right to vote in Germany. And this was a big milestone, right? That must have felt very empowering, seeing as how women had been sidelined in politics for centuries there, right? Women in the Weimar Republic were entering universities, they were taking jobs in the government, they were joining the workforce. It was a very bold move from the traditional pre-war norms, right? But progress, there always comes some pushback, right? So the Weimar Republic, with all its economic and political chaos, was really dealing with a shift in social norms as well, right? The war had torn apart gender role was. And while women embraced newfound freedoms, others struggled with what to do with them, right? The conservative factions of this country, that's like the upper and middle class, weren't really thrilled with women stepping out of the home and into public life, right? While women had access to voting and education, the expectations were still there, that at least when it came to society, that they would fill those traditional roles as wives and mothers. And then when the Nazis came in, they really didn't agree with all this progress, right? Hitler and his regime rose to power, and they wanted to reverse everything, right? Many Nazis really wanted the ideal woman to be a homemaker and mother. Nothing more and nothing less, right? No more education for women, no more independence. The ideal woman, according to Nazi ideology, was the perfect mother, raising the next generation of our Aryan children for the state. It was a huge difference between the freedoms that women had previously enjoyed in the Weimar Republic. And Sophie was born in the tail end of the Weimar era, right? So she had witnessed the changes that women experienced during the Weimar Republic. And by the time she was adult, the Nazis had taken that all away. Women were encouraged to stay home, have kids, just focus on the family, right? But Sophie had a pretty sharp mind and a pretty big sense of justice, and wasn't interested in just that, right? Not to say she wasn't interested in being a mother and wife. I wouldn't imagine. But she wanted more, right? She saw the world for what it was. It was a place where evil was really starting to gain ground, and she wanted to fight back, right? Sophie didn't let the social pressures being a woman under the Nazi regime dictate her path. And so we'll get into her life, but she really stepped out of that, right? And so now that you have a little idea, like I said, of what it was like for women and what was going on in that area, let's talk about it. Let's rewind a bit and let's talk about Sophie Scholl. So she was born in May of 1921 in Forchtenberg, Germany. Her family played a pretty crucial role in shaping the values that would later define her life. So Sophie was not just any child of like a typical German family. She was one of 6 siblings. That had to be a pretty lively household, right? But really set the Scholl family apart was the values that they had, right? Honesty, integrity, and a deep, deep appreciation and love for education. They weren't just about textbooks. They wanted their children to really think critically and form their own beliefs, particularly when it came to morality and right from wrong, right? Her father was a major influence to Sophie. He wasn't one to keep quiet, right? Even when speaking up meant risking his life. Robert was he was an outspoken critic of the Nazi regime, and he passed that rebellious spirit on to his children. And this was at a time when many people were either supporting or ignoring the Nazi party altogether, right? And he was telling his children to always stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. His vocal opposition to Hitler's regime made him a target, but he really never backed down, and that's kind of a bravery, and that set the stage for Sophie's own courage later in life. Definitely some parents of the year, I would say. As for Sophie, she wasn't just a rebellious spirit. She was very curious. She was a passionate learner. She really excelled in her studies, especially when it came to philosophy and literature. Sophie wasn't really content with just memorizing things for the sake of memorizing and passing exams. She really liked to dive deep into the ideas and texts she read. It wasn't for her just about grades. Like, it was about understanding the world and around her and finding ways to challenge the norms. It was an intellectual curiosity that was kind of a rare thing, or really frowned upon once it got into the Nazi regime. Because Nazis used propaganda, and that was the main educational tool. And Sophie's mind was designed to question it, and that was not what the Nazi Party wanted. But eventually the Second World War broke out, right? And this kind of broke up Sophie's world a little bit, right? Along with the world of every German citizen, really, and everything was turned upside down. Hitler's regime was tightening its grip. Brutal realities of war were becoming impossible to ignore, right? Sophie, though, it wasn't just about surviving the chaos, right? It was about standing up for what was right. That's how she had been taught. So most of her peers were pretty much, brainwashed into supporting Nazi ideology, or they were too frightened to speak out. But Sophie wasn't. Sophie wasn't going to let the world around her drown in injustice. That just wasn't who it was. So she was going to sit by. She wasn't sitting by while people were getting murdered. She was imprisoned, oppressed. Instead, falling into line. Everybody was falling into line and keeping quiet. And Sophie made the choice, a choice that many others weren't willing to make at the time. She decided she wanted to stand up. She would fight back, and she would do that in a way that just didn't involve violence, right? Because that was against what Sophie was trying to do, right? She wanted ideas and words, and those can be very powerful weapons. So Sophie, with her brother Hans and some of his friends in the University of Munich, became members of White Rose resistant movement. Now, the White Rose wasn't your typical underground organization. They didn't use weapons to take down the Nazis. No, this was all about words, like I said, ideas, truths, and the truth. And their mission was to raise awareness about the brutality of the Nazi regime, especially the inhumane treatment of Jews and the devastating consequences of the war itself. They wrote and distributed leaflets calling on their fellow Germans to resist and not be passive in the face of this evil. Sophie wasn't content really to be a bystander. She wasn't going to just write a few notes to call it a day. She really got her hands dirty. She helped with the writing, printing, and she helped distribute. And this was all a risk. And she knew full well it was a risk. And she did it anyways. It was not just a small act of defiance. It was basically a direct challenge to the Nazis. And getting caught meant certain death, right? And Sophie knew that. But she wasn't afraid. And she was driven by her sense of justice, the one her father installed into her, and her unwavering belief that if you just sit there, you are just as responsible for the atrocities that happen as someone who's actually committing them. So it wasn't easy, and it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't something you could do in secret without worrying about the consequences. But Sophie and the rest of the White Rose, they didn't wait for someone else to step up. They stepped up themselves, and that was pretty amazing. Most people were turning a blind eye to what was happening, the horrors and everything that the Nazi regime was committing. But Sophie couldn't, And unfortunately, if we fast forward a little bit in that rebellious career, February 18th, 1943, Sophie and her brother Hans, alongside her other resistance members, were at the University of Munich and doing what they have done many times before, distributing leaflets. And these leaflets, of course, had pretty harsh words about the Nazi regime and really were urging fellow Germans to stand up against the tyranny. For Sophie and Hans, this wasn't just a political act, it was pretty much a moral obligation. They weren't just handing out paper, they were handing out a lifeline to humanity. They wanted to open people's eyes and to the horrors that were unfolding. But this time, unfortunately, things went wrong. Sophie and Hans threw the leaflets in the hallway of the university. As Sophie and them were throwing the leaflets in the university, they were caught in the act. A custodian named Jakob Schmidt, who pretty much been passing by, noticed them and alerted the authorities. And like that, the life they had known was pretty much shattered. The Scholl siblings were arrested, and their fate was sealed. What followed next was the kind of injustice that no one no one should ever experience, Unfortunately, it was too common during the Nazi regime, There was a trial, but it was a farce. Sophie and Hans were accused of treason, a charge that carried the death penalty. The trial, pretty much, it was a sham. There was no real defense put in place for them. There was no fair hearings, and the jury was already primed to convict them. The Nazi authorities were not interested in justice here. They were interested in silencing any form of dissent, especially from people like Sophie and Hans, who were actively challenging the very foundation of their regime, The trial was over pretty quickly, and the verdict was clear. It was guilty. So Sophie and Hans were sentenced to death, and their execution was set to take place just days later. So on February 22nd, 1943, 4 days after being arrested, the Scholl siblings were executed by guillotine. Their deaths were brutal, and they came at a time when resistance was just really beginning to gather momentum. But what Sophie and Hans left behind in those short days of defiance was more powerful than their tragic end. They left behind a message that resistance, courage, and hope could be there. The White Rose movement, though it was short-lived, became a symbol of moral integrity and a time of just darkness. Sophie's name, along with those of her fellow resistors, would be remembered long after the Nazi regime fell. The aftermath of Sophie's death really resonated far beyond those few days in February. Their actions led to their own demise, but it really inspired countless others to resist and question the Nazi regime. The leaflets had been circulated throughout Germany, and while their lives were cut short, the message lived on, right? The White Rose became a beacon of defiance, reminding future generations that standing up for what is right, even in the face of unimaginable consequences, can leave a lasting legacy. Sophie's story, life ended with the execution, but her story did not. And in fact, it became pretty much a lasting symbol of the bravery and resilience of those who were willing to stand up against brutal regimes and tyranny. Tragic fate really wasn't the end of their story. I think it's a story that should be repeated and should be told. So what was the legacy? So obviously it resonated far beyond Nazi Germany. Obviously it became a symbol. White Rose movement became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, armed with, they were armed with nothing but conviction and courage, and the ability to write and tell the truth about what they were seeing. Well, the White Rose leaflets were, sent out in secrecy. They really helped build hope for a better future. In Germany, she's now remembered not just as a martyr, but as a hero who stood up when it was needed most. Her story has been taught in schools, recounted in history books, celebrated in films and plays. The bravery that she had, the courage that she had, has become woven into the German identity, Her story actually even crossed borders and inspired movements worldwide, in places where people continue to fight for freedom, justice, and all that. She's still a well-known figure. Her courage is a testament, I think, she wasn't just an anti-Nazi protester. She was a student of philosophy, a thinker who really used her mind to challenge the moral decay of what was happening. And that's amazing. And I think we need Sophie Scholls in this world. We need White Rose movements in this world in order to keep authoritarianism and tyranny in check. And so hopefully this story of Sophie Scholl has, inspired you, given you some hope, maybe giving you some ideas. Her courage lives on, and I think it's there in the hearts of all of us that want to challenge tyranny, to speak out against injustice, fight for a better, more compassionate world. We all, a lot of us have a little bit of Sophie Scholl in us, so hopefully we use it in the right way. Yeah? And that's it. I hope her story has inspired you. I hope this month has inspired you. I hope you go back and check out the other amazing ladies I talked about this month. And stay tuned for next month. I've got some really amazing warrior queens, I think is how I'm dubbing them. And some little known warrior queens. In fact, all of the ones I'm doing, I would say I knew a little bit about, but not a lot. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Anyways, I'm going to leave this with very simple, the typical drill. If you want to reach out to me, there's ways that through social media. You can support the podcast financially through Buy Me a Coffee or a Patreon, or if you would just simply like, comment, review, share, all that kind of good stuff, that would be amazing. If you want more about this and so much more, check out the Medium publication. Make sure if you're into spiritual wellness, holistic healing, magical, mystical kind of things, check out my other podcast, Our Mystic Road Trip. And guys, just stay curious, stay blessed, stay safe, and most of all, stay questioning. Question everything. Yeah? All right. Have a wonderful week, guys. I'll see you next week.